While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
If you go right back to the early part of chapter 14 in Mark, we read how Jesus predicts what Peter is going to do. So listen to this, just a little bit of a refresher here. Jesus told them, all of you will desert me. For the scripture says, God will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised from the dead, I will go ahead of you to Galilee and meet you there. And Peter said to him, even if everyone else deserts you, I will never. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, Peter. This very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times, saying you don't even know me. No, Peter declared emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And all the others said the same thing. Now, the big question is, were these men lying when they said that? Did they have every intention of fleeing? Well, of course they did not. We're in a situation where in the safety of this place, when they're all together with no threats on the horizon, they are perfectly confident in their ability to stand behind Jesus. They're not worried. They are absolutely sure that they would be able to stand with courage and conviction if there is a threat to Jesus. Now remember, he's been telling them for some time now that he's going to die and go back to his Father. And this does not sync with what they think a Messiah is supposed to do or to be. But they think that ultimately there is going to be a showdown, and they are absolutely convinced that they'll be okay when that moment arrives. The problem, of course, is that that's not the way it works. Judas has betrayed Jesus. The troops arrive to arrest him. He's taken before the council. And there's Peter, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, following at a safe distance because he doesn't want to be close enough that he's going to get caught up in this whole scenario. But he probably thinks he's doing the right thing. And frankly, he's doing better than the others who just leave. They just leave. Peter, at least, has the courage to follow at that distance and to be there to keep an eye on things. And at that point, he probably feels absolutely helpless. But let me ask you this. What gets Peter into this trouble to begin with? He's so adamant, so emphatic. If there's a problem, I will never desert you. I think there are 2 problems. And it brings me to my first point. 4 words I want you to take away today, and the first one is, and this is an important one, arrogance. Because what Peter has in the beginning is this pride, this arrogance which says, I don't have to worry about this. I'm going to be perfectly okay. And Lord, you can count on me. Well, I think it's not just pride. I think it's pride and comparison. Because Peter is so busy looking at the other people in the group that he's not looking at himself. He's not looking deep inside to see what's going to happen and what's there to cause those things to happen. I think the first thing that we have to take away from this story, ladies and gentlemen, is that the minute we think we cannot fall, we are almost destined to do that. Now, Proverbs says that pride goes before a fall. You know that passage, but I wonder if you know how that looks in your own life. We need to be the kind of people that are not looking at other people and comparing ourselves with them to determine our level of spirituality. And yet I would submit to you that that's exactly what most of us do a lot of the time. We say to ourselves, well, I may not be perfect. I may not be doing everything I'm supposed to, but I'm doing more than they are. Or we have a tendency to look at the people in the world and say, well, at least I'm not like that. And that goes to the attitude that we saw around communion today, where if we're so busy comparing ourselves to everybody else, we are not going to be aware of just how vulnerable we are. We have to understand one very clear principle, and that is, truth be told, we are capable of anything. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that you are probably capable of good things that you can't even know. I think depending on circumstances, sometimes God places us in positions where we come through in ways that surprise even us, because he gives us the capacity, and he gives us the power, and he gives us the talents to be able to do what he wants us to do. And that's good. It's wonderful to know that God places such faith and trust in you that he not only gives you things to do, but he is also going to empower you to do whatever he calls you to do and to be. But we need to couple that awareness with the sure reality that we are capable of doing things we think we are not ever going to have to worry about. And the minute we think that we cannot fall, we cannot fail, we cannot betray Jesus, that's when we become the most vulnerable. I have done things that I never would have thought possible for me to do, and I'm talking about negative things. And the problem is, a lot of the time I get into trouble because I don't even think it's a possibility. And you don't prepare for something that you don't think is a threat. And so that brings us to this whole idea that arrogance can get us into a lot of trouble. And we need to combine that with awareness. Awareness. Because I think that once Peter understands that this is a different situation, then all bets are off. He's fine. When it comes to looking down the pike, he's clear about his faithfulness. He's confident in his relationship with Jesus and in his own ability to stand. And then when they're in the garden and the troops show up and things start to go badly, that's when he wavers, because we can all feel confident when we're in the safety and the confines of this building. What we really need to do is to have an awareness of where we are when we're not here together, when we're not in the safety and security of the church, when we're out in the world trying to be who God calls us to be. You need awareness of two things. You need to know that there are going to be differences in your life depending on the circumstances and the areas of your life that we're talking about. Now look, Peter does fine right at first. He's ready to go. If you think about Thomas, remember Thomas, the guy we call Doubting Thomas? When Jesus first starts to talk about how he's going to go and he's going to die in Jerusalem, it's Thomas who says, okay, let's go with him and we'll die with him. And when Thomas said those words, I'm convinced that he really meant those. Have you been in a situation where you were absolutely sure that you could follow through with any kind of commitment you needed to have? A commitment for God, a commitment to other people, only to find out that, wow, you just have not been able to do that. Well, awareness means that you're going to know where you're strong and where you're weak, because if you're like everybody else, and you are, you're going to have a set of strengths in your life. There are things that are never going to be a temptation for you. You could put $2 million in a pile in front of me, and that would not be a temptation for me. That would not be a temptation for me because I have everything I need and I don't need anything else. That's not anything I ever struggle with, never have. But I can list 10 things that you could put in front of me where I would fall flat on my face, because there are so many other areas where I am vulnerable, and they have everything to do with my insecurities and the things that trouble me and the things that I fret about, that maybe you look at and think, why would anybody even be worried about that stuff? Why would you even be tempted by those things? But we all have that. I don't care if you've been in the church for 40 years. You've got things that make you vulnerable, and you need to know what those things are. There will be areas where you're strong. There will be areas where you're weak, but you're always going to have that interplay between the strengths and the weaknesses. And those things will change. They'll change as you get older. They'll get different as you mature. but you're always going to have areas of weakness. And the minute you think you no longer have them is when you are the most vulnerable to falling flat on your face. So be aware that circumstances or areas of your life will be absolutely crucial. You need to do some inventory. You need to do some inventory and be sure that you are well aware of where your weaknesses are and what you're going to do if you're confronted by those things. You need to have the planned escape route. And that's not always going to be easy because you can't always foretell what's going to happen, but we know that we're all vulnerable in some way. If you don't know your weaknesses, the people and the forces that would try to exploit you do. So it is in your best interest to do the work and to ask God to help reveal to you where you are the most in need of his strength, where you need to shore up the spiritual resources, where you need to double down on a reliance on God so that you don't fall and you do not fail. So arrogance is the first problem. I think awareness is a way that we get past some of that. The third thing is, I'm going to call this one acceleration. You could also use the word accumulation, because what happens with Peter is he starts out okay. He probably doesn't even see any real problem with what he's doing. After all, he's there, he's keeping an eye on his friend and his Savior. But what he's doing is he's putting himself in a position where one thing leads to another. That's where acceleration comes in. Nobody gets in the car and hits the gas pedal and crashes and burns on purpose, unless they're suicidal. But that's often what happens. We start cautiously. We have these little things that I talked about a couple of weeks ago that often get in the way, and we make these small compromises. We tell these little lies. We go out of our way to hold on to our convictions, but there are these little chinks in our armor, and those weaknesses are very easy for others to exploit. And so we have to be careful that we don't just take one little compromise and hold that dear. Take another little compromise and hold that close. Not take another compromise and make that part of who we are. Because if we do that, it's only a matter of time before those little things become big things. Peter begins by just staying close. He hasn't done anything wrong. But then what happens is he's confronted. A servant girl says, "Look, we know you're a Galilean. We can tell." They probably could tell by his accent. Because if you were from the north, if you were from Hicksville, and that's what Galilee was. It was way up north. Jerusalem was in the south. And the people in the south were much more educated and sophisticated. At least they thought so. And they could tell those rubes from up north. So they confront Peter. It's interesting, the servant girl twice says, "Yep, you were with him. I know that. I can tell. I recognize you." Peter denies it twice. The guards, the people who are in charge, if they hear any of this, they choose not to do anything about it anyway. But Peter is clearly worried about getting caught up and maybe being arrested along with Jesus. And he doesn't want that. So he denies. He starts to lie. And then he starts to cover it up. And I don't have to tell you that that's just a fixture of our lives, isn't it? Let me tell you that oftentimes the cover-up is worse than the sin. Lots of politicians have learned that lesson in a very, very clear, deep way. If you watch TV, almost every sitcom you've ever seen began with either a lie or a misunderstanding or a stupid move, and then the rest of the narrative is how they try to cover it up, and in the end it never works out, and they have to come clean, and usually they live happily ever after. It's not the way it works in life. But if we do try to cover, if we do try to obfuscate, if we do try to pretend like everything's fine, what happens is one sin leads to another. One thing leads to another. You have to cover your tracks. You have to make sure that you're not caught. And so you end up compounding all of these things one upon another until you're in so deep you don't know what to do. Acceleration. You've gone from 0 to 100, and now you're ready to crash and burn. So we have to be careful to watch out for those compromises, those little things that will do us a lot of harm if we're not so very careful. And then, along with awareness and this idea that it all begins with arrogance, and this acceleration is the fact that ultimately, if we're going to do what we need to do, we have to have acceptance, and it works on two levels. Works on two levels. We have to accept our weakness. Because if we will do that, it will make us more dependent on God. It will convince us and convict us in a deep and profound way of our need for Him. Because if you don't think you need God because you're so strong or you're so spiritual, well, then you're not even going to be taking upon yourself everything that He has available to you and for you. Accept your weakness. Accept your reliance on God. Accept the fact that you're never going to be entirely who you want to be. And you know what? That's okay, because that's why Jesus came in the first place. He came so that He could take away our sin, cover with His blood our weaknesses and our frailties. You don't have to be perfect because Jesus was already perfect for you. That is the whole point. We need to accept that. Not to say, well, I don't have to try because Jesus has got this and He's going to take care of everything. No, as we get to know Jesus, as we become more aware of everything that He's done for us, that should cause us to be grateful. And that should cause us to live a life of gratitude and thankfulness, a life of powerful testimony to how good and great God is for us. Accept your weakness. But while you're at it, you need to accept the love and the grace and the forgiveness of God. Because there are so many people that are not able to do that. They think often that they are so far gone that they are irredeemable, that God couldn't possibly love them the way He says He does, because after all, look at what I've done, they say to themselves. There are other people who are so much on the opposite extreme that they can't even conceive that God would have any problem with them whatsoever, going back to that arrogance I talked about. I literally had a woman say to me one time, I can't think of a single sin that I've committed. Because she had a very definite idea as to what sin was and what it was not. And a lot of things that sin is were just not on her list. But that kind of attitude is in the church. By the way, she was a Christian, not somebody out there. And so what I'm trying to say is, if we will accept that we are frail, that we need God, if we will accept that God stands ready to forgive us and to empower us, then things will be okay. Peter is ultimately restored. Judas is not. And yes, as Susan said in the outline, that has a lot to do with their response to their own sin and weakness. And that's a sermon for another day in a couple of weeks. But it is so true that the same thing holds for us too. If we are going to fall flat on our faces and be content to stay in the mud, that will lead to one outcome. But if in fact we embrace the forgiveness that God makes available to us, if we use our failure as a learning point, as something that will not only bless us in the days ahead, but also bless those who come after us, then that is completely different. By the way, did you catch what Peter said there when he was talking to Jesus? He said, no, I would never leave you, Lord. I would just never do anything like that. But I think it's really important to understand what Jesus is saying as He looks at the situation. He says, you know what? It's going to be like the shepherd is taken out of the way and then the sheep scatter. That's exactly what it's going to look like. And that's exactly what does happen, isn't it? But there's this interesting little passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. Listen to this. This is Peter, the betrayer, the one who's later restored, saying, He personally carried our sins in His body on the cross so that we could be dead to sin and live for what is right. Now let me read that again. He says, Jesus took our sins to the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By His wounds you are healed. At one time, you were like sheep who wandered away. But now you have returned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. What do you think he was thinking about when he wrote those words? Peter thinks about the words of Jesus as he outlines for these early Christians what they need to be like. And he looks at himself and he says, yeah, at one time I ran. I was scattered. But I've come back. And that's the key. Peter comes back because Jesus welcomes him back. And we're going to talk about that next time. But here's what the takeaways happen to be. Do that personal soul searching. Know where your weaknesses are. Know where you're most vulnerable. Know where you're going to get hit, where you're going to have the most failure if you are not ready, if you are not aware. Be aware that your strength is not one side or the other. It doesn't mean that you're weak or you're strong. As you've heard me say a million times, every Christian is neither weak nor strong. We are Christians who have weakness and we have strength. Sometimes it will seem like your weakness is far ahead of your strength, and sometimes it'll be the other way around. Do the inventory. Know where you're weakest. Be aware of what you can do to combat that. The next thing is watch out for those little compromises we talked about earlier. Just make sure that you're not just going full speed ahead without thinking about where the trajectory is going to lead you. When we look at our lives, when we look at our sin, we need to make sure that we're jamming on the brakes, not hitting the accelerator with the big things or the small things. And then when we fail, because we inevitably will, then we need to make sure that we are open to the power of God to heal us, to restore us, to change us, and to transform us into what we were always meant to be, even if it seems to us like we're never, ever going to get there. Let me close with one short story. If you go to Indianapolis, they have a wonderful speedway there. You've heard about the Indy 500. What you may not know is that 42 drivers have lost their lives on that track, 42 over the years. Actually, the total is more like 72, but 42 drivers, actual drivers, have been killed. The interesting thing is, if there is a crash on that racetrack, and indeed in most, the drivers will tell you that they don't look at the tape, they don't look at the recordings. A lot of them will not go anywhere near the recordings. They don't want to relive the crash. They don't want to see how their friends have died. When there is a crash, the first thing that happens as soon as the racetrack is closed is a crew goes out and they paint the wall and they repair the damage so there is no lasting impression of the fatality. For a long time, it was very clear that when somebody was dead, they would not even admit that over the loudspeakers. They would simply remove the body and then they would tell people later that the driver died in hospital when in actual fact he had died on the track. Do you see what's happening here? Do you see why these things are done? There is no memorial at the museum that's 2 miles away from the track. There is no memorial that talks about how these men were killed. Because the whole idea is, if you just don't think about it, if you just cover it up, if you just pretend like everything's okay, then maybe it will be. Well, you might be able to get away with that if you're a speed trap. But we can't do that in our lives. We need to fully acknowledge where the problem is, where the sin lies, where deep within us we are most likely to betray God. We need to do everything we can to make sure that we don't let our lives get out of control so that that happens. But inevitably it will. And instead of denying the consequences, we need to embrace the consequences, accept responsibility, learn from whatever it was that got us into trouble to begin with, and then use our experience to bless others who are going through the same stuff. Did you hear the reading from today? If someone falls off the rails, if somebody is not doing what they need to do, then you who are godly, you who are spiritual, should gently and humbly help them back onto the right path. That is our collective responsibility. When I fall, I need you there to pick me up and set me on the right way back to God. And when you fail, you don't need judgment. You don't need another sermon. You need redemptive love that says, okay, we accept that this is who we are. But we don't have to accept that this is where we stay, because God has other plans. What I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that if we live in denial of who we are and what we do, it will be easy for that denial to creep its way into our relationship with Jesus. No denial, better chance of no denial.